In today's lesson, we'll be learning how to create the equation of a line given slope and a point on the line. If you recall, the equation of a line in slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. Slope is rise over run. However, we also learned an alternate form of this equation, and that is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And a point is also called a coordinate. It is made up of an x coordinate and a y coordinate. In our first example, we want to find the equation of a line given its slope and a point on the line. I'm going to circle the important pieces of information. Our first step is to start with the general equation of a line in slope-intercept form, which is y is equal to mx plus b. There are two things we need. We need slope and we need the y-intercept. We're already given the slope, so let's substitute that in. I'm going to say sub slope is equal to -2. Instead of writing m, I'm going to replace it with this -2. Everything else stays the same. Remember, we want to figure out what the y-intercept is. However, there are other variables within the same equation. But x and y represent any point on the line. So let me write that on the side. X and y represent any point on the line. Keyword being any point on the line. If you look at our original question, we've been given a point on the line. So I'm going to take that point and substitute that into our existing equation. So I'm going to say sub 0.13. Let's create a little bit more space for ourselves. If you recall, every coordinate is made up of an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. Therefore, I'm going to substitute in 3 as my y, and I'm going to substitute 1 in as my x. Once you get to this step, you will just need to simplify some of these numbers and solve for b. So the 3 doesn't need to be in brackets anymore. 2 times 1 is 2, and the b stays the same. At this point, b is not isolated. It is stuck with this 2. This is actually positive 2. I'm going to write that at the side. The opposite of positive 2 is negative 2. Therefore, to get rid of this positive 2, I'm going to have to subtract 2 from both sides of the equation, and that's what I'm going to do. 3 subtract 2 is equal to 2 subtract 2 plus b. Again, let's simplify some of these numbers. 3 subtract 2 is just 1. 2 subtract 2 is 0. I'm not going to write in a 0, which just leaves me positive b, but I'm not going to write in the positive sign. And typically, we like to read from left to right, so I'm going to flip this so it reads b is equal to 1. We've just figured out our y-intercept, and if you recall, the slope was already given in the original equation. The slope was -2. Let's put all of these pieces of information together now. The general equation of a line is y equals mx plus b. As I said before, we needed to figure out the slope and the y-intercept. We just did that. The slope is -2, and the y-intercept is +1. Therefore, the equation of our line is y is equal to -2x plus 1. In our second example, we want to find the equation of a line with the slope 3/2 and a point on the line of -4, 3. Let's highlight the important pieces of information. the slope is 3 over 2, and a point on the line is negative 4, 3. We're going to be using the exact same steps as the previous example. First off, start with the general equation of a line, which is y equals mx plus b. We need to figure out two things, the slope and the y-intercept. We've already been given the slope, so let's substitute that in. Sub m is equal to 3 over 2. So instead of writing m, I'm going to write 3 over 2. And everything else stays the same. We need to figure out what b is equal to. However, it is stuck with this x and a y. This x and y represent any point on the line. We've been given a point on the line, so let's substitute that in. Sub negative 4, 3. At this point, I'm going to substitute in these numbers. So instead of y, I'm going to write 3. And instead of x, I'm going to write negative 4. Everything else stays the same. A lot of students get stuck here because they forget how to multiply fractions. Negative 4 is the same thing as negative 4 over 1. And when you multiply fractions, all you need to do is just multiply the denominators and multiply the numerators. You do not need a lowest common denominator. This 3 stays exactly the same. 3 times negative 4 on the top, that is negative 12. And 2 times 1 is just 2. Now, you want to isolate b, but b is stuck with this negative 12 over 2. Before we start manipulating, let's simplify this. 12 divided by 2 is 6, and a negative number divided by a positive number is negative. Everything else stays the same. The opposite of negative 6 is plus 6. Therefore, I'm going to have to add 6 to both sides of this equation. So you'll have 3 plus 6 equals negative 6 plus 6, and that b stays exactly the same. 3 plus 6, pretty simple, that becomes 9. Negative 6 plus 6, that cancels out, which leaves you with b. Now, we read from left to right, so I'm going to switch this around. So b is equal to 9. Since I've just figured out the y-intercept, and I already know what the slope is, since that was given in the original question, I can write the equation of my line. I'm going to do it on the side. So y is equal to mx plus b, this general equation of a line in slope-intercept form. Remember, we wanted to figure out the slope, and we wanted to figure out the y-intercept. We were given the slope. The slope was 3 over 2. We had to figure out what the y-intercept was, and that happens to be positive 9. Therefore, the equation of this line is y equals 3 over 2x plus 9. In our third example, we want to find the equation of a line that passes through point 4, 2 and is parallel to y equals negative 3 over 4x minus 5. The key pieces of information are as follows. This line passes through the point 4, 2, and it is parallel to this other line. If you recall, parallel lines have the same slope. Therefore, the slope of our line should be identical to the slope of this parallel line. At this point, we're going to follow the exact same steps as before. We're going to start with the general equation of a line, which is y equals mx plus b. We're going to substitute in our slope. Since these are parallel lines, that means they have the same slope. So it will also have a slope of negative 3 over 4. So instead of writing m, I'm going to write the new slope of negative 3 over 4. Everything else stays the same. Remember, we want to figure out what the y-intercept is, but we have these other variables of x and y. X and y represent any point on the line. We've been given a point on the line, and that is 4, 2. So let's substitute that in. Sub 4, 2. Which means I'm going to write a 2 instead of a y here, and I'm going to write a 4 instead of an x. Everything else stays the same. Again, at this point, we are going to simplify some of our numbers. Students get really confused here because they forget how to multiply fractions. 4 is the same thing as 4 over 1. Once we do that, this should become pretty easy. That 2, we don't need the brackets anymore. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. And 4 subtract 1 is 4. We can still simplify that. The 2 stays the same. Negative 12 divided by 4 is negative 3, because 12 divided by 4 is 3, and a negative number divided by a positive number is negative. The b stays the same. This b is stuck with a negative 3. The opposite of negative 3 is plus 3. We're going to add 3 to both sides to get rid of that negative 3. In our next step, we want to simplify some of these numbers. 2 plus 3, it's pretty simple, that's 5. Negative 3 plus 3, that cancels out, that becomes 0, but we don't write zeros in. Therefore, b is equal to 5. And like I said, we read left to right, so let's flip that around. B is equal to 5. We know what our y-intercept is, and we know what our slope is. Therefore, we can write the equation of this line. So the general equation is y equals mx plus b. We know our slope is negative 3 over 4, and we know our y-intercept is 5. We figured both of these values out. So I'm going to write it as negative 3 over 4x plus 5. Therefore, the equation of this line is y equals negative 3 over 4x plus 5. Remember, these lines are parallel. Therefore, they have the same slope. In our last example, we want to find the equation of a line that passes through point negative 1, 4 and is parallel to y equals negative 5x plus 2. Here are the important pieces of information. The line passes through this point, and it is parallel to this other line. Remember, parallel lines have the same slope. Therefore, the slope of our line is going to be negative 5 as well. I'm going to use the exact same steps as the previous question. Let's start with the general equation of a line, which is y equals mx plus b. Remember, we want to figure out the slope and the y-intercept. We've been given the slope. The slope is negative 5, since these are parallel lines. So instead of writing m in, I'm going to write negative 5, and everything else stays the same. We want to figure out the y-intercept, but there are these other variables with it. X and y represent any point on this line. We've been given a point on this line, so we can substitute that in. I'm going to say sub point negative 1 and 4. This point, y gets switched with 4, and x gets switched with negative 1. Everything else stays the same. Let's clean up some of these numbers. The 4 doesn't need to be in brackets anymore. Negative 5 times negative 1. Remember, 5 times 1 is 5, and a negative number times a negative number makes a positive number. I'm not going to write the sign in, however. At this point, b is still stuck with this 5. The opposite of 5, remember 5 is considered positive 5, the opposite is negative 5. Therefore, I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. Let's simplify some of these numbers. 4 subtract 5 is negative 1. 5 subtract 5 is 0, so that cancels out. We don't write that in. So negative 1 is equal to b. Again, we read from left to right, so let's switch this around. So b is equal to negative 1. That is the y-intercept. Let's put all of these pieces of information together now. We wanted to write the equation of the line in the form of y equals mx plus b. However, we did not know the slope or the y-intercept of our line. We were told that our line is parallel to another line. Therefore, the slopes are the same. And we just figured out the y-intercept to be -1. So let's put those numbers in. Y is equal to -5x subtract 1. And that is our final answer.